So I'm going to talk to you about an experiment we did in the innovation panel where we were trying to encourage people to give us blood spots to do blood analysis, and we use feedback as one of the ways of trying to encourage people to do that. But I just wanted to start a little bit by saying kind of why we on Understanding Society are interested in people's blood. So Understanding Society is a multi-purpose survey. Peter said this earlier, and we're funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, and then we onwardly share our data to users all around the world via the UK data service. And we do an annual questionnaire of about 40 minutes, which has core and rotating content on a very wide range of domains so that we can kind of track change and stability in people's lives. And one of the things that ESRC were very keen for Understanding Society to do was to be a biosocial resource, so to collect both biological data and social data. And so in the second and third waves of Understanding Society, a nurse was sent out after the main interview to interview people and to take physical measures like blood pressure and lung function, to take blood samples, and then from those blood samples we've produced a range of blood analytes, genetics and epigenetics data. And you know, there's been quite a lot of research done using these biomeasures together with the social data in Understanding Society to look at how people's kind of social factors get under the skin to cause health problems, and how health problems might be causing changes in people's social lives. But at the moment, we only have one snapshot of these data in waves 2 to 3, and we really wanted to be able to measure change in these biological indicators for people. But the approach we took at wave 2 to 3 was really very expensive. It was a challenge for the fieldwork agencies in the UK because we needed more nurses than they had. Because we did it as a two-stage process, a lot of people dropped out and various other things, and kind of the world just moved on. And so we decided to experiment with ways that participants might collect biological samples for themselves in our innovation panel. And that's feedback is one of the range of experiments we did there. And just kind of as a having done this, we convinced our funders to refund or to fund us doing another wave of biological data collection on the main survey in a couple of years' time. So the innovation panel, I think Peter said these things, is very similar to the main Understanding Society survey, slightly different geography, just to make it more manageable. And it has about 1,500 households and about 2,000 adults. And because there's quite a high turnover in this sample, there have been various refreshment samples. And we use it as a way of doing both methodological experiments for ourselves, as well as kind of enabling other people through an open competition to apply to do experiments. And 13 waves of these data are already in the data archive, and a range of others are kind of in the process of being collected or specified or delivered. And then, so to go specifically to the focus of this talk about giving feedback, in health surveys, which is kind of where my background is, it's just generally expected that we will give feedback of any clinically relevant data that we collect. And so when there was a systematic review conducted about whether what encouraged people to take part in longitudinal health studies, whether feedback was one of those factors was mentioned by a lot of the authors of the papers on how to improve response, but no one had actually practically tested it in any way. We have hints about it. So in general population studies, a lot of request feedback when they're providing blood samples, and in qualitative studies of people with kind of known health conditions, they say they want feedback. In the last Understanding Society wave, sorry, my dog, I'm just going to shut the door because my dog's making a lot of noise. Sorry. So in the last Understanding Society wave, 12% of the sample who didn't give blood cited not getting feedback as a reason for doing that. But obviously there were some concerns. I mean, Vera mentioned some of this, that in an observational study, giving feedback might change behaviour, and it can be very costly to do it. So we decided, as part of this more broader kind of investigation of how we might get participants to collect biological samples for themselves, whether feedback was going to help us. So at IP12, participants were asked to provide dried blood spots, and they were randomly allocated to a group to be offered feedback or not, and they were told that in their advance letter. And we had 3 questions. So whether giving feedback would affect the overall response to the whole survey, both in the wave that they took the blood and in the subsequent wave, whether offering feedback actually changed people's willingness to give blood itself, and then whether that was affected by the mode that the interview took part in, whether it was affected by any kind of population characteristics or by how long people had been in the survey. And so the design of IP12, there were 3 arms. So people were randomized to either have a nurse come to their house to do all the biological collection for them. That was kind of the traditional approach that we're comparing the others to. The an interviewer would go to their house, not do the biological collection themselves, but leave kits, explain it to participants, which is sort of some of the things that have just been being discussed about apps, so that they could explain it to participants and leave the kit for the participant to do the sample collection themselves, or an online survey where people were just had it explained to them as part of the online survey. So in the nurse visit, the nurse with consent took venous blood, so whole blood, as well as blood spots from the participant. And all the participant had to do then, other than sit there and give lots of blood, was to post the dry blood spots back to the survey, because they didn't dry sufficiently for the nurse to take them back with them. With the interviewer arm and the participant web arm, people were asked if they wanted a kit as part of the interview, and if they did, it was posted to them or given to them by the interviewer, and then they took the sample themselves and posted it back. Everybody got a £5 voucher for returning the kit. And as I said, within each of these arms, people were randomized as to whether or not they would get feedback. So IP12 took place in the second half of 2019, and overall 84% of the sample took part in their mode. There was very little kind of mode switching went on after kind of their initial allocation. So a few people assigned to the nurse interview decided they wanted to do an online interview. Some people allocated to an interviewer decided to do it online, and about a quarter of those people allocated to the web survey switched to having a face-to-face interview with an interviewer. A small group of people only did proxy interviews or had proxy interviews done for them, so they're not included in this analysis. And as well as looking at response in IP12, we then looked at the response a year later in IP13, but obviously that took part in the second half of 2020 when there were no face-to-face interviews. So it was just web or telephone follow-up. So looking at my first question of whether being offered feedback for blood results affected overall response, at IP12 itself, there were 2,400 eligible households. In 59% of them, at least one person took part, and that was slightly lower in the non-feedback group than in the feedback group. But in terms of the actual adults, the people giving blood, there was 1% difference between the kind of adults in the feedback group who took part and those in the non-feedback group. So kind of overall, I don't think feedback had any effect on taking part in the same wave as it was offered. In the subsequent wave, a year later, although with very different kind of modes, there was 2,270 people from IP12 were invited to take part in IP13. And again, there was just 1% difference between those who took part at IP13 from the feedback group the previous year and those who weren't in the feedback group the previous year. And then in terms of IP12, we checked the kind of randomization had worked, and the characteristics of the feedback and non-feedback groups are very similar. So what happened? So this is the percentage of people who gave consent to give us a dry blood spot sample, not whether they practically managed to do it, by mode. And as you can see for the nurse, we have a really high percent, more than just over 70% were willing to give a blood sample, and that really didn't, there's kind of 1% difference between the feedback and the non-feedback group. For the interviewer, it's kind of was a 37% in the non-feedback group were willing to give a sample, and about 47% in the feedback group. And then similarly, there was a slightly higher amount in the web survey willing to give blood if you offered them feedback than those in the non-feedback group. So that overall there is a difference between the group who had feedback or who were offered feedback and the group who weren't. We kind of thought about why these differences might take part, and I think it echoes some of the conversations earlier. So you might expect a nurse to be taking blood samples for you. They might be very encouraging about kind of the value of doing that when they're interviewing you, and hence that might explain the very high uptake and the little impact of feedback that there was. For the interviewer, that was higher again. Again, you have somebody in person kind of explaining the value of doing this for the survey and handing out the kit. Whereas in the web, although all that information is part of the web survey, there's no one actually there kind of interacting with the participant to persuade them that this would be a good thing for them to do. When you look at it by the actual mode, there isn't really a lot of difference. So the gap for the interviewers is slightly smaller, and the gap for those taking part on the web is slightly bigger. So this is kind of how the mode actually, the mode that the people actually took part in. And overall, 45% of the non-feedback group gave us blood, and 52% of the feedback group. So there was a difference there. So we then modelled the willingness to give us back in the feedback group against the non-feedback group in the 3 different modes, kind of looking at other characteristics. So for the nurse, being offered feedback made no difference to whether or not people gave us blood. I mean, it was slightly higher, but it wasn't statistically different, and kind of controlling for participant characteristics or how long people had been in the survey made no difference to that odds ratios. The interviewer, again, kind of repeating myself, I feel, there was a significant difference for offering them feedback, but again, kind of characteristics and length of time in the survey didn't really kind of influence that. And similarly for the web, the other characteristics didn't influence it, but there was a significant benefit in terms of willingness to give blood if people were offered feedback. Beyond the feedback, those people at older ages were more willing to give blood than those people at younger ages, and those people from higher educational groups were more willing to give blood than others. And the length of time that people stayed in the or had been in the survey made no difference to whether or not people were willing to give blood, which slightly surprised us, but anyhow. And then, because we were trying to learn from IP12 for a future survey, we asked people a lot about their experience of giving blood afterwards and why they did or didn't do it. And so, perhaps not surprisingly, in the non-feedback group, 20% said that the reason that they hadn't been willing to give us a blood sample was that they got no feedback. But then in both feedback groups, the main reason people said for not giving blood was they didn't like the idea of giving blood. And that was more true where people had to give venous blood, so the nurse was drawing blood from them, than the dry blood spot, which is just a finger prick. So against that background, in March 2021, in the COVID survey we've heard a little bit about already, we asked for blood samples again. And for those, we asked for capillary blood samples. So it's still a finger prick, but you actually have to kind of squeeze quite a lot of blood out of your finger into a test tube. And that was for people to find out whether or not they had previously had COVID. And we found a much higher level of people consented to do that. I mean, possibly that, you know, obviously COVID was much more salient for people than some of the things we were offering feedback with the more general blood sampling. But also there was a kind of different attitude. Lots of people were being tested for health reasons more generally in the general population. So to conclude about the value of feedback that we found, and again, kind of in contrast to some of the points Vera was making earlier, although we found that offering feedback had no effect on the overall response to the survey, we found offering it did increase the willingness to give blood. And there was no effect with the nurses and most effect in the web survey. And those things I've said before, older and more educated participants were more willing to give blood, and length of time in the survey didn't have much effect. And then because this meeting is kind of slightly broader than just the feedback, just to say the other things that we're experimenting with at the moment, or have experimented with, around participant collection of biological samples, and different people, some of whom are on this call, are investigating at the moment. So as well as having collected dried blood from people, we also collected venous blood. And so we're comparing whether the actual measures you get from that are similar enough to use dried blood spots. We tried to persuade people to collect their own blood pressure by going to chemists or their GP, or using a home monitoring kit. And we're looking at who did that, and again, whether or not it's similar to measures collected by the nurse. And we also collected hair samples as a way of kind of looking at people's hormones, which was much more popular, or much less popular amongst men than it was among women, maybe because of the length of hair that you needed. And in IP15, which is in the field at the moment, we are asking people to measure their own waist and hips. We sent them a tape measure to do that. And we also have an app, which Annette can tell you a bit more about than me, probably, about that gets people to take photos of themselves as a way of measuring their body size. And then in IP16, which is going into the field next year, we're asking parents to photograph or give us data. So it was kind of interesting to hear Vera say that people are much more willing to type in data than to kind of extract data from things. Measures of their child development, so height and weight and immunization status. But there's some information about where you can find out more about what we did at IP12. This paper is available as a preprint, and as I said, we are now collecting biomarkers in 2024 to 26, and so our protocol for that is about to be released. Thank you.